Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the All About Fats, the good, the bad, and the in-between for arthritis. My name is Daniel, and I will be hosting this webinar today. And I'll be hosting the webinar along with our expert. We'll talk about her just in a few minutes. Let me just give you a few facts about myself, just for you to get to know me. First one is I am an arthritis warrior. I was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis when I was 18, 19 years old. And then a few years later, my diagnosis evolved to rheumatoid arthritis. So I've been living with this condition for just a few years. I'm 38 now, so for that many years. That's the first one. So go AR, right? The second one is I'm also an account manager for an IT company here in Ohio. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I just moved to this state maybe 2.5 years ago. I'm loving it. And the number three about me is I am a food blogger. I love cooking, I love photography, and I love sharing recipes. So I do have a food blog. I've been running this website and YouTube channel and all of that thing for probably 8 years now. So I do share mostly healthy, sometimes not so healthy recipes in there. I love sharing what I do. So that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about. So please just go ahead and take a look if you want. So today we're gonna learn a lot about fats, about how fats interact with our diet. And I know that all of us will get very, very educated today. Our expert is awesome. Before we go ahead and introduce our expert, let's talk about the Insights feedback, the Insights program. This program right now and some other programs from Arthritis Foundation, they are created because of you, because of your feedback, because of your comments and the things that you let us know. So it is very, very important for the foundation and for all of us really to take a few minutes, 10 minutes to go ahead and participate in the Insights program. We want to hear what you have to say. The foundation wants to hear what we want to say, what we have to say. So let me just show you a quick video that shows you something that you are hopefully already familiar with. For those who are not familiar, welcome to the Arthritis Foundation, and let's just go ahead and take a look at this short video.
By taking part in the Live Yes Insights Assessment, you help change lives today, including your own. And you help change the future of arthritis. It takes just 10 minutes or less to share your experience and make a difference. Answer simple questions like how often you felt arthritis pain in the last week. Ongoing insights data from people like you will lead to new resources that ease daily life. Your insights show what kind of support you need in your community. You improve the healthcare system. You focus researchers and others on top priorities. You'll make more research funding possible, leading to new groundbreaking treatments. The power is in your hands to change things now and for the future. This is your opportunity to change the future of arthritis.
So that's it. So I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. The foundation really uses this information. Is really useful for all of us to go ahead, take a look, go to the website, go to search, find the Insights program, take the 10 minutes, really. We just launched a new Insights program for juvenile arthritis audiences. So if you're a parent, an uncle, please go ahead, take a look at the website, go and it will be very beneficial for for you guys, for all of us really, and the foundation to hear from now juvenile arthritis people. So really, really thank you so much for taking the time. If you already done so, if you haven't, please go ahead and help us out. Before we begin, just some kind of rules for today's session. All of you are now muted. That means that I can't hear what you are saying, either me or our expert. We can't hear anything that you're saying, so you were muted. And however, that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. So we really encourage you to ask questions. I know that I'm going to ask a lot of questions, so you can do that by using the chat or the Q&A, button on the bottom of the screen. You should see, depending on where you are using this app, the Zoom app, you're going to see a chat, a Q&A, icon. Just go ahead and tap on that and submit your question. We'll be sure to have a few minutes at the end of the webinar, at the end of the session, to respond to all of your questions, or most of your questions. We'll do our best. So we'll do our best. So that's just for you to know. Also, right after this webinar is finished, you guys will receive an email from the Arthritis Foundation. Continuous improvement is really important for the foundation, and we really want to keep these webinars happen. And as they're happening, we want them to be better and better over time, right? So we really want to hear how we're doing and what can be done better in the future. So you'll have an email once this webinar is done. Just provide us with your feedback. And thank you so much for doing that in the future, all right? Oh, sorry, can you please go to the next slide? Today, we have the honor of welcoming back our best friend, Petitpain. She's been with us. She's a friend of the Arthritis Foundation, and she's now again to talk about fats and how fats interact with our diets as patients of arthritis, right? So she has a long resume. She's now the Chief Operating Officer of Synergy Healthcare, Health Tech. She is the spokesperson of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And she used to be the wellness director of the Office of Health Promotion in South Carolina, in the Medical University of South Carolina. She has over 18 years of experience. She has a lot of knowledge, and we're super grateful and happy that she's here with us to share her knowledge, to listen to our questions, and hopefully answer all of them. So Debbie, thank you so much for being here. Again, we are really grateful that you're here, and take it away.
Thank you, Daniel. That was amazing. That's a nice, warm welcome. I always love being able to support the Arthritis Foundation and talk to all of the members and try my best to answer your questions. I'm not promising I'll be able to answer all of them, but I will do my best. If you were able to join us for the last webinar that I was able to present to you guys, it was about carbohydrates. And I hope that if you did attend that, or if you watched the recording on the website, you were able to see that the topic is a little bit more complex than maybe it seems right on the surface. One of the things we learned that day is that there's multiple different types of carbohydrates, and that some of them are really good for us and other ones we want to minimize. That is really what we're going to try to talk about tonight with fat. That fat itself can be demonized by some groups, it can be put up on a pedestal by others, but really the topic is a little bit more nuanced. And I want to try to break apart what we know with the current body of evidence so that you feel comfortable understanding what they are, what the role is they play in your body, be aware of the recommended amounts based on the current science that you should be consuming or staying under as far as limits for some of them. But most importantly, we're going to talk about some really practical strategies for how you can include the best sources of fat in your diet. So who remembers these? I could probably, if I was able to have a conversation with every one of you, I bet that I could summarize what your view is on dietary fat if I knew what decade you grew up in. And if I knew whether or not you knew what this product was. So I know what this product is. It was a staple dessert in my house when I was growing up. In the 1980s, my dad, before he turned 40 years old, survived a heart attack. And so my parents did all the things that you would do if that was you. And they learned about exercise, and my dad quit smoking, and they learned all about cooking. And my mom completely redid what she had in the refrigerator and the cabinets and how she was preparing meals for the family, because what she was learning was that it was really important to follow a low-fat diet. At the time, our understanding was that following a low-fat diet was the best way to prevent somebody like my dad, who already had a heart attack, from having another one, or primary prevention for just the general public and keep them free of cardiovascular disease longer. The reason we had that hypothesis actually comes from this man right here, Dr. Ancel Keys. He was one of the first scientists to publish some nutrition studies where they looked at populations across the world and said, how are these people eating? How are these people dying? What can we learn from those associations? And, you know, if you think that Dr. Keys was really in the prime of his career in the 1950s, and that really was the genesis of nutrition science, I think that we can all agree that as a science, this is still a relatively new field, and we're learning more and more every single day. And what Dr. Keys found in a landmark study called the 7 Countries Study, where he was examining these populations primarily around the Mediterranean, but all over the world, it was the first major study where he looked at diet and cardiovascular disease risk. And what he was able to find is that diets that had a really high intake of fat had a higher risk of developing heart disease, and that serum cholesterol, blood pressure, diabetes, and smoking are universal risk factors for coronary artery disease. And that's what the science about those risk factors continues to show us today. The issue is that when he made his publication, he essentially tried to say that intake of a lot of animal foods like meat, butter, cheese, those things generally led to levels of high cholesterol in the blood and high heart disease. It was difficult sort of to communicate that. So at the end of the day, it was distilled into this general public health recommendation to follow a low-fat diet. The government put some hard numbers around that and was advising the population to eat less than 30% of their total calories from fat in an effort to prevent heart disease. So my parents did that. They started slashing fat everywhere they could. They got rid of the peanut butter, they swapped out their butter for margarine, and they picked up these fat-free cookies as the dessert choice. However, I think we can all agree that in that period of time, or since then, the rates of cardiovascular disease have not really gone down, at least not from a lifestyle perspective. They've gone down because we've gotten better with treatment options, but we've also had a corresponding obesity epidemic. And a lot of people look to that and they say, look, this low-fat dietary movement, it didn't work. But the reality is we never really actually did the experiment. In fact, during that same period of time, we actually consumed more fat from 1971 to 2000. We actually consumed more grams of fat every single day. It just looked like the percent of calories from fat, remember, we were trying to go to under 30%. It looked like we were moving in the downward direction because we started eating more calories. We ate more fat, we ate more calories, but we ate more calories from particularly carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates like those SnackWell cookies. And so it kind of gave us this false sense that we were doing what we were being told to, but not getting healthier. But in fact, that's not really what happened. So let's go to the next slide and say, why is it that we had a hard time with this experiment? Why is it when we started to try to cut back on fat in our diet, we just started eating more? Well, it's a no-brainer. Fat tastes good. I mean, like really good. And not only does it taste good, but it makes other things taste good too. And it has a very critical role from a culinary application. So for example, fat helps us transfer heat and transfer heat evenly so that things cook at sort of a standard temperature. They help things to actually get tender. So when you include a little bit of fat, for example, in bread, it keeps the bread moist enough and tender enough that it crumbles and it's delicious to eat. It helps us to whip things. It helps us to mix things that we want to actually create a blend with water or water-like substances, so your salad dressings. It helps to develop gluten so that it can be stretchy and do what it needs to do to flake and crumble when you bake it. It also helps us to, of course, enhance flavor. So there's always going to be sort of this tug of war between the three culinary components that enhance flavor the most, and that is fat, salt, and sugar. So what we saw in the food supply is that as we started to cut back on the amount of fat in foods, we compensated by adding more sugar and adding more salt. Definitely not health promoting options. Well, why is it that, so we know food tastes really good and it's important from a culinary food perspective, but what about in the body? Well, it turns out that as a nutrient, fat is absolutely essential. We have three sources of energy for the body. We call these our macronutrients because we need them in large amounts. Carbohydrates, fat, and protein are the three. But out of the three, fat is the thing that provides us the most amount of energy or the most amount of calories bite for bite. Every gram of fat that we consume provides the body with 9 calories compared to carbohydrates and protein, which give us only 4. So if you're out in the wilderness and you're really trying to scrape by and make sure that you can get enough energy in to make it to the next day, high sources of fat are going to be really beneficial to you from a survival perspective because you get more energy out of every bite. The issue, however, is that regardless of what you're getting in your diet, whether your energy is coming from fat or carbs and protein, if you consume more than you need to use that day, you're going to store the extra in your body as body fat. And this allows you, in case you ever get deserted on that stranded island, like this poor lady here on this cartoon, or Tom Hanks in that movie with the volleyball, it allows you then to have some extra energy stored so that in those times of scarcity, you have enough to survive. And the body's capacity to store this extra energy for a rainy day is unlimited, as far as we know. So in addition to needing fat for just general energy and survival, we also know that it's used in a variety of ways within the body. So for example, we take fat and we convert it to essential hormones. We also convert it or use it to help absorb fat-soluble nutrients that are critical to survival, such as our fat-soluble vitamins. Fat in the body and the way that it's stored in the body actually plays a vital role in protecting our organs against injury. So you can imagine somebody accidentally elbowing you in the stomach. You've got a lot of vital organs in that abdominal area, and your fat helps to protect you from injury and also keep you warm and help to make sure that your body temperature is regulated. It also, of course, allows us to tap into those energy stores if we ever need them in times of stress. And research actually shows that, we talk a lot about the health risks that are associated with carrying around too much weight, but there's also health risks that are associated with being underweight. And that's what this J curve is showing us here. It's showing us that your risk of death actually increases if you fall below the optimal range of weight for height for your health. So there is an actually increased risk of death if you get to be too thin. So fat is vital both from consuming it in the diet as well as having it on and in your body. So what happens if we eat these fat-free cookies, which if you go back, by the way, to that SnackWell's box and you look at how many calories are in a cookie, it was the same amount of calories as was in a regular cookie. That was sort of like the aha moment, is that it wasn't just about the fat, it's really about the number of calories that you're taking in. But a lot of people were eating a lot of those cookies thinking, hey, they're fat-free, I can have a second serving. But what they didn't realize is that calorie for calorie, it was the same as a regular cookie. by consuming more, either because they felt good about themselves, because they were fat-free, or because the fat-free cookie was just generally unsatisfying, it was lacking in some way, we ended up taking in more calories than we really needed. And by eating all of these calories, we as a population, we gained weight. And the problem with excess weight is that it increases our risk for chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but it also is associated with chronic inflammation. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what that mechanism is, at least in one example. But when you're eating all of these calories, if after you're eating, your body doesn't need all of that energy right then your body's going to store that extra energy in an energy reserve. It actually absorbs those excess calories, processes them into fat, which it stores in a droplet in a fat cell. The droplet itself, which is unlike any other type of cell that we have in the body, will actually make itself bigger to accommodate more fat storage. And the body, again, as I mentioned before, has an unlimited potential to store fat. 1 pound of fat that you store is equivalent to about 3,500 calories. So for every pound, let's say, for example, you gain, it means you're consuming 3,500 calories more than your body actually needs in a particular day. The bathroom scale is simply just an indicator of what we call our energy homeostasis, or are we balancing our energy needs between what we need on a regular basis and what we're actually putting in it. If you see that scale start to creep up, it means that you're taking in more energy than you actually need, and your body's holding on to that in your reservoir in case you're ever in one of those stranded island situations. However, we also all know that very few of us are ever going to be stranded on a deserted island, and many of us actually struggle with that excess weight, again, which is associated with chronic inflammation. So finding the balance, we know underweight has a risk, overweight has a risk. It all is about finding that balance and about some of the other ways that the different fats work in our body, which we're going to talk about soon. We're going to talk about next, actually. So when we actually talk about the fats that we're consuming, we tend to categorize fats into things like saturated fat, unsaturated fat. I'm sure you've heard those terms, and we're going to explain them in a moment. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. When we consume fat, every time we consume it, it comes in sort of a group of 3. They're all attached to a general backbone, which is this blue circle in the cartoon here, with a tail of these different fatty acids coming off of it. And there's 3 tails for every single one. And when we talk about fat, like, oh, it's saturated or it's unsaturated, it's these tails that we're talking about. But you get them in sort of packages of 3. And that's important to keep in mind, just because you're not just getting one or the other. You're not getting just saturated fat or just unsaturated fat. You're getting a little bit of all of it every time you eat them. Really what we're trying to say is which one is in there the most, which one is in abundance. And that's kind of what we refer to. Hopefully that'll become more clear as we move forward. Let's talk for a moment about what happens when you eat these dietary fats. We also sometimes call these dietary fats triglycerides. So tri because there's 3 of them, and glyceride because that's the name of that backbone that was the blue circle in the previous slide. So when you consume these dietary fats, the first thing that happens is, of course, your body breaks them all apart into their little building blocks, and then it absorbs them. And during digestion, some of these tails, these long purple things that you're seeing in your cartoon, are paired with a protein carrier so that they can get transported to the blood. So we all know, just from trying to shake a bottle of salad dressing, that oil and water don't mix, right? And these fatty substances that we're digesting, well, they're like the fat or the oil in your salad dressing. If you want them to be able to dissolve and move around your blood, which is like the water in your salad dressing, it has to be attached to something in order to be able to do that. And we've heard about some of these transport molecules before, because my guess is your primary care physician has tried to check the amount of these transport molecules in your blood. So for example, the name of one of them is LDL cholesterol, also known as low density lipoprotein. And that helps to carry cholesterol to the body's cells, so the cells can use it for energy or can store it for a rainy day. We've also heard of HDL, or high density lipoprotein. which actually helps the body clear cholesterol to get the cholesterol out of the blood and back to the liver where it can be recycled and disposed of. One of the issues with the LDL transport molecule, though, is that it can actually increase our risk for heart disease, specifically through a process that we call atherosclerosis. So what happens is when this, again, it's these triglycerides that are combined with a protein in order to be able to move around the blood so that they can go to the different cells of the body. But what happens specifically is that this particle starts to penetrate the walls or the inner lining of your blood vessels. And when that happens, they start to break down and the immune system says, hey, hold up, there's a foreign something here going on and I need to go clear it. So you get this immune response. And the immune response includes an inflammatory response and the release of white blood cells, which go out to try to scavenge these LDL remnants. And in this process, you get this plaque buildup, sort of like you think about plaque on your teeth, on the inside of your artery walls. And that makes your artery walls start to lose their elasticity or their ability to expand. For example, when you're exercising and you need more blood to start flowing, it also limits, or of course, narrows the actual opening that allows for blood to flow through. And if you were to ever get a complete blockage here, or if that plaque was to burst, which also can happen or rupture and cause a clot, that actually is what will lead to heart attack or stroke. So LDL is one of the markers that your physician can monitor over time through blood draws. And our goal across the board for the general population is for you to have an LDL level lower than 100. Conversely, the HDL cholesterol, sometimes we nickname it healthy or helper cholesterol, actually helps to clear this LDL out of the way. So your doctor is going to check for that level too. And the goal for men is for you to have an HDL of 40 or higher. And for women, we tend to have slightly higher HDL. The goal is for HDL to be 50 or higher. So let's talk about how we can kind of take some of the things we've learned so far and now start to overlap what's happening in our body with what's happening or what we're taking in from the foods that we're eating. And like at the end of the day, what am I supposed to do when I come home and I open the refrigerator and say, what's for dinner, right? Well, first of all, one of the key things to think about is that we have several different types of fatty acids, which we're going to describe a little bit more in a moment, and they don't all have the same effect on the body. Some of the tails are longer than others, and some of them are more rigid than others. And both the length and the structure will determine the characteristics of these fatty acids, both in the foods and how they impact the function in the body. So for example, some fatty acids are going to increase your LDL, that would not be good, and increase your HDL, which may be good if you're having a low one. Some of them are going to lower both, some of them are going to have no effect. But one of the things we want to consider is that regardless of that, all of these fatty acids have the same amount of calories per serving, which is 40 calories per teaspoon of oil. And we really want to make sure that we're limiting the oils in our diet to less than 5 teaspoons a day. So let's move on and talk a little bit more about these different fatty acids. So one of the best things, really one of the best things that you can do for your cholesterol profile and your overall inflammatory state is to avoid trans fats or trans fatty acids. Trans fats are harmful to the body because they actually cause an inflammatory response. They make your LDL, which is the sort of bad cholesterol, I say that in quotes, they make your bad cholesterol go up, and double whammy, makes your good cholesterol, the HDL, go down, double whammy. The recommendations are actually to have 0 grams of trans fat in your day. And it took a very long time for the government to release that recommendation. But effective 2019, trans fats are actually banned from the American food supply. So how do you know if you have trans fats in your foods? Well, I think it can first be helpful to understand a little bit more about what trans fats are, like how they come into being. Let's go back to like our SnackWell's cookie days. Back then, people were saying fats are bad, but we started to also know that solid fats like butter and other sources like that were bad as well. And we were starting to tell people to eat plant oils instead, which in some parts of the world is very normal. But in America in particular, we tend to like to spread our fats. And so this idea of, hey, a liquid oil, I can't really dump that on my morning toast. That doesn't work for me. The food industry stepped up and said, we got you. So what they said is we can take liquid plant oils, we can force a lot of hydrogen into them to make them solid instead, so you can spread them on your toast. And that process is called hydrogenation. So we started actually introducing hydrogenated fats or hydrogenated oils into the food supply. But the problem is that when we force those hydrogens into those plant fats, they get a kink in them. So trans is sort of exactly what you think it means, going across. So we get a funny kink in the shape of the molecule. And that kink is actually biologically what causes all the problems. But you're going to find that, you know, the food manufacturers are basically saying, hey, this is amazing. We found a really cheap and affordable way to make your processed foods super shelf stable. That box of SnackWell's cookies, it's not going stale for like until, you know, ever. It's never going bad. That protein bar that you have on your hand with the chocolate coating, it's not going to melt when you hold it, because we got you. We created this type of fat that's going to help make your food more portable. So you're primarily going to find fats, trans fats in foods that are highly processed. So these are going to be baked goods like cakes, pie crust, biscuits, frozen pizza, cookies, crackers, energy bars. You're also going to find it in some of the old-fashioned stick margarines and a lot of fried foods. So the restaurant industry tends to use trans fat a lot for frying. You can also now determine or look on a food label to see if there's trans fat in your product. So you can see it highlighted in this slide in yellow. The one thing I do want you to know is that there is some room for error or room for rounding that is given to the food supply. So you can actually have as much as a half of a gram or 0.5 grams of trans fat in a food per serving, and it will show up on your label as 0. So if you want to double check, even if you see the 0, and even if it's not a highly processed foods, if you drop down to your ingredients list, look for things like the word hydrogenated in that ingredients list. If you don't see it, that's a really good verification that this food probably doesn't have any trans fat in it. Again, it's primarily going to still show up even in these minuscule amounts in some of the foods that I mentioned. Another one where I think that we find it a lot still is in coffee creamers, both the liquid and the powdered kind. So if you're using that, you might want to kind of take a closer look at your label. So what are some other healthier swaps that we can do? So one of the best things that you can do to eliminate the trans fat in your diet is, of course, look at the food label like we just talked about, but also switch from using things like butter shortening and other fats that are solid at room temperature to using some plant oils instead. Margarine has traditionally been a really rich source of trans fats. Now that they've been banned from the food supply, we're seeing some healthier alternatives on the market. But the primary thing is looking for something that's got a softer texture. And of course, avoiding things that are fried, packaged, and processed. The other thing that we want to watch out for is saturated fat. And this is probably one that most people are the most familiar with, but you do want to reduce this. Saturated fats have been associated with increasing your, air quote again, bad cholesterol, that LDL. And the dietary recommendations are to limit your saturated fat to less than 10% of your total calories. That's according to the dietary guidelines for Americans. I will tell you that the American Heart Association is actually a little bit more aggressive than that. They want to see less saturated fat in your diet, especially if you've had a previous cardiovascular event. So if you are eating, let's say 1,800 calories a day, which would be appropriate for a very active person, 10% of your calories is about 20 grams of, is about 10 grams of saturated fat a day. Sorry, I had to double check my math. So 10 grams a day from saturated fat, that's not very much. It adds up kind of quickly if you're not careful about your choices. And the other thing that we know is that right now Americans are consuming too much saturated fat. They're consuming about 13% of their calories from sat fat. So we definitely have some room that we could do, 13 to 16%, depending on your age and your gender. So where's the saturated fat coming from? This is an interesting pie chart I really like based on national assessments of what people are actually eating. And you can see that 35% of the saturated fat in our diet is coming from mixed dishes. These are things like sandwiches, burgers, and tacos. And primarily what's driving those mixed dishes, if you look at that little blowout rectangle, are going to be things that include animal foods like meat and poultry and cheese. And that's because saturated fat is only found in animal foods and tropical oils. So if you're eating more of a plant-forward diet, that's a great first step in reducing the amount of saturated fat that's in your diet. So again, saturated fat is found primarily in animal foods and as well as processed foods. So some things that you can do. First of all, trim any visible fat. This could be the white stuff that you see kind of laying on top, or, you know, we all know this idea of the kind of strip like that goes around a New York strip, but even taking off chicken skin is another great option for removing visible fat. But what about the invisible fat? So when we talk about marbled meat or a higher fat meat, that is because there is also fat that actually runs through the muscle in meat as well. That's kind of our invisible fat. And the only way really that you can reduce that is to go ahead and buy the meats that are as low fat as possible. So you can actually get like a 97% lean. I will tell you that sometimes people will go for ground turkey or ground chicken thinking it's leaner than ground beef, but unless it says ground chicken breast, they're actually grinding the skin also. And so the fat content is still really high. So just watch out for that. You also want to try and, if you can, watch your portions of the meat, because even if you're buying the lowest fat and even if you're trimming the visible fat, it's just inherent in that food product. So for example, if you could add mushrooms to ground beef when you're making hamburger patties, that inherently will reduce the amount of meat that you're having you know, at one setting. Or if you add more beans to, say, a stew that you're making to reduce the amount of meat that you have in there, that allows you to have it, but at a smaller portion size. The other source of saturated fat that we really want to watch out for is dairy. So choosing low-fat dairy products instead of full-fat dairy products is important, but the consumption of cheese in America has truly skyrocketed. And that is a very rich source of saturated fat in our diet. It's also a very, very high source of sodium in our diet, which is another nutrient that we're sort of over consuming. And then you also see this picture of the salads. The salads are a wonderful health promoting food, but if you douse them in a salad dressing that's got trans fat or saturated fat in it, you're negating some of those effects. So being careful about the dressings that you're using on things like salads. Take a sip real fast. Oh my goodness, Debbie, you've just told us all these things that we need to cut back on. What about the things we can do more of? Because that's always the best part, right? So that's the next slide, if you don't mind. What we do want to include is if you're going to cut back on your saturated fat, and we do also want to cut back on refined carbohydrates, which what I mean by that is things like chips and crackers and white flour versions of things that are really snacky, that come in packages that we eat with our fingers. If we replace those, we need to figure out, well, what am I going to replace them with? And what we want you to replace them with are what we call unsaturated fats. So saturated fats and trans fats, as I mentioned before about trans fats, we shoved all these hydrogens into them. Saturated fats naturally have hydrogens in them. What's the point of having all of this hydrogen in these molecules? It makes them rigid. So think about if I were to take a stick of butter out of the refrigerator and slap it on the table, it holds its shape, right? That's because all those fatty acid tails are completely saturated with hydrogen molecules, which makes them very rigid, unable to spin in space, not very fluid. Unsaturated fatty acids, conversely, are have one or more double bonds in them. A double bond is simply an opportunity to add more hydrogen. So there's a place in there where the molecule can spin on itself. It can form more shapes. It can twist and turn. It's a little bit more fluid. So when we talk about unsaturated fats, that's really what we're talking about. We can break it down a little bit further to talk about monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. So mono means one. A monounsaturated fat means there's one double bond in the molecule. Poly means many. And so polyunsaturated fat means there's two or more. And that's really the difference. And what you're going to like from the chemical structure perspective, they're found in a lot of overlapping foods, of course, but they also kind of each come from some distinct places. So our polyunsaturated fats, again, they are more fluid. They're going to be liquid at room temperature. They're found mostly in nuts, vegetable oils, and fatty fish. And including them helps you to lower your LDL, or what we call the bad cholesterol. Whereas your monounsaturated fats are found mostly in avocado, olives, other vegetable oils like olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil, some other nuts and seeds. And not only does it help to lower your bad cholesterol, but it also helps to raise your good cholesterol. So this chart here is basically saying, you know, there's a lot of give and take. So at the end of the day, what we want to know is that if you can take the refined carbohydrates out of your diet and include more unsaturated fat, especially the monounsaturated fats, there's evidence to show that you'll reduce your blood pressure, reduce your LDL, and reduce your coronary heart disease risk. If you take some of the saturated fat out of your diet, so think about removing some of that butter, Crisco, and lard, and use more of the unsaturated fats, especially the polyunsaturated fats, you are actually going to be able to reduce your cardiovascular disease risk as well. So regardless of whether you're using the mono or the poly, I think a lot of people get really kind of stressed about that. It's really better just to think about your unsaturated fats and using them instead of white flour kind of versions of highly refined carbohydrates and instead of saturated fats. So let's talk a little bit more about how you can do that. So the first thing is that instead of thinking about saturated versus unsaturated, I'd like you to think more about oil or liquid versus solid. So if you look at this bar graph, and I'm hoping that you can see it, what you'll see is that every oil has three colors associated with it. Each color is telling you what percent of either saturated fat, which is the darkest color, or unsaturated fat, which is the lightest two colors, is in there. And what we're looking for is to include more of the fats that have the least amount of dark in the bar graph. But if we look at the polyunsaturated or the unsaturated fats, which are the two lighter colors, there may be a little bit of a preference for the polyunsaturated, which is the lightest of the three. And I'm going to tell you why in a moment. But the one thing I really want you to notice is that coconut oil is at the top of this list, and meaning it has a very high saturated fat content to it. Well, you didn't really need a bar chart to know that. What you needed to know is that when you scoop it out of the jar, it's solid at room temperature. And things that are solid at room temperature means they have a high fat content. So what we really want to do is move toward choices that are below that middle line. Saturated fats or solid fats, we consume a lot of them. We consume as a population more than 300 calories a day. That's a fair amount. And so we want to start to move toward liquid fats. And even the Mediterranean diet doesn't include more than 5 teaspoons of oil a day. And that at 40 calories per teaspoon, that's still 200 calories every day that's coming from oils. One of the best ways that you can just kind of decrease your intake overall is don't deep fry, but look for other ways that you can prepare foods that don't require quite as much. So if you can first go from using a solid fat like butter to a liquid fat like olive oil or canola oil, or maybe even a spray in a nonstick pan, that'll help reduce some of the overall fat that you have in your diet. Things like broiling, steaming, and poaching are other cooking methods that don't require fat either. And all of those things put together can help you reduce the amount of solid fat in your diet. I mentioned previously that there is a slight preference, at least for me, for polyunsaturated fats in your diet. And that's because there's a couple of versions of them that we call essential. And essential means we can't make them in the body, but we require them. So we must get them from the diet. Omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids are examples, and you've probably heard about these. What's interesting is that omega-6 fatty acids are prevalent in the food supply. They're primarily found in corn, sunflower, soybean, and peanut oils. And we get so much of them that they might actually be causing some internal inflammation in the body. What we're not getting enough of is the omega-3 fatty acids. And part of that is because there's a limited sort of food supply source for them. Primarily, they're found in marine algae and fish, because the fish eat the marine algae and then concentrate those omega-3s. They're found in some plants too, like flax seeds and chia seeds. But the biggest thing is to think about with omega-3 fatty acids is that if you consume them, they can actually help to reduce inflammation in the body. They can also lower your risk of cardiovascular disease, but consuming omega-3 is not enough. You also need to try to reduce the omega-6s that you're getting in your diet. So just making some oil swaps will go a really long way for that. So this slide here just shows you a few more differences between the omega-6 and the omega-3s. So again, the 6s, they're essential, but we get plenty of it. Whereas the 3, they're essential and we don't. So here's a couple food sources for you just to serve as a reference on where you can find them. Well, what is one of the best ways that you can kind of flip this ratio and get more of the omega-3s? And that is to eat fish. Both the dietary guidelines for Americans and the American Heart Association recommend 2 servings of fish per week. An average serving is about the size of the palm of your hand, or 3.5 ounces. They don't have to be the fattier fishes or the most oily fishes, but obviously the more oil the fish naturally contains means the more of those omega-3 fatty acids that you're going to be taking in as well. So if you can, a double whammy would be to also just, instead of just thinking about adding it, think about replacing one of those mixed dishes we were talking about before, which is really high in saturated fat, something that's got a lot of high fat meat and cheese, for example, maybe some refined carbohydrates like a bun or white noodles in it. If you can make that switch, you're really crossing off multiple goals in one meal. I do, in the next slide, want to acknowledge that there are some concerns for some people around the heavy metal content that is in seafood, so mercury being an example. This is actually a chart that was jointly released by the FDA and the EPA in 2017, where they basically said, hey, listen, we understand that mercury in seafood and that contamination is a concern, but we've looked at the food supply and we've recognized that the benefit to consuming fish far outweighs the risk of the heavy metal content, even for our most vulnerable population, which is our pregnant women, that we really are coming out together as joint agencies to encourage you to consume it. They then took the most commonly consumed seafood choices and categorized them for us into the best choices are the ones that are going to be the lowest risk for metals. And what they found is that 90% of the seafood that Americans tend to consume naturally fall in the best choice category. I will tell you that actually EPA and FDA just, I said yes, I'm getting my notes on the fatty acids and my government agencies mixed up. The FDA and the EPA actually just re-released this chart about 2 or 3 days ago. There is no significant changes, but if you want the most up-to-date information, they actually just issued a press release a couple days ago, and I would go check that out. What if you don't eat fish? Not eating fish is super common for a lot of reasons. There's parts of the country where it's probably harder to access. It's also one of the top 9 allergens, and there's a lot of people that simply don't care for it or don't really know how to prepare it. So there's other ways that you can get the omega-3. One of them is just to go to the source that the fish use, which is the algae. So my daughter actually loves these dried seaweed sheets as a snack. That's actually available at Costco and at your store closest to you, perhaps. But that's really where the source of these essential omega-3s are coming from. It's just that the fish help to kind of concentrate that for us. You can also get another version of the omega-3 and your body can convert it. And sources of this are going to be flaxseed, walnuts, canola, hemp, chia, and soy. So that is one of the ways that you can get a little bit more of this. you do want to just be cautious that these foods are also, of course, calorically dense. And so, for example, peanut butter or a jar of peanuts, I know guys that'll come home and they like rip the top off and they'll eat the entire jar in one sitting. You want to be careful about that. And of course, if you're using nuts, choose the unsalted versions. Soy foods can also be a really good source. And then there's a lot of fortified options that are out now as well. And then finally, the very last thing is just to watch your portions. So if you want about a palm size of protein source at your meal, you want a heaping fistful of vegetables, maybe a smaller scoop of a carbohydrate. Your fat is the smallest portion of all, being only about the size of the upper part of your thumb, maxing that out at 5 of those per day. That would be about equal to 5 teaspoons. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that, 100 calories of fat, it's not really very much food. So especially if you're talking about oil, if you were even just to take that little cup and shoot it and just drink it, it's not going to make you feel full. But if you eat 2 tablespoons of nuts, which also have some protein in it and also have some fiber in it, that actually is going to contribute to your overall sense of satiety and fullness. So even just it's great in the sense that when you make some of these shifts to the healthier options, you also are going to help be full and satisfied on portions that kind of keep you in track. Quickly, so that we have time for questions, and please forgive me, I know that I ran over sort of the presentation time a bit, but I do want to address some of the top questions that we get related to fat overall, and then we'll open it up for any other questions that you guys have. The keto diet. The keto diet is known to be a high-fat diet or an extreme version of the low-carb diet. It's a diet that has been around actually for more than 100 years to help treat epilepsy in children, but it's become more of what we would call like a fad diet from the idea that you can lose weight quickly with it. What we do know after really digging into this over many years is that for the metabolically fragile, so people that, for example, have brittle diabetes or other metabolic diseases that their team is really struggling to get under control, there's a clinical application of this diet. For the rest of us, what we know is that there is some clinical evidence that shows if you're looking to lose weight and you're comparing a low-fat diet to a keto diet, it's possible that the keto diet produces a quicker weight loss, but by the time you start following participants at 6 months out, there's no difference. But we do know that in order to stay true to the keto diet, you have to consume a lot of fat. And because you're doing that, your intake of trans fat and saturated fat, it's almost impossible to keep it under the levels that promote that chronic inflammation and heart disease. So if that's an approach that is appealing to you, I would really love to know more about why that is and what it is you're really trying to use it to achieve. And so I would refer you to my 100,000 colleagues of registered dietitians and nutritionists and suggest that you meet one-on-one for a personalized approach. And you can find an RD to work with at our organization's website, eatright.org. And in the top right corner, there's a Find an Expert button that you can click. The other thing that I wanted to mention is what about grass-fed butter and what about grass-fed meat? This sort of comes into the second grouping about MCT oil. So I was mentioning before that the structure of the molecules of fatty acids plays a role. So does it have does it have a double bond? Does it have hydrogens forced all in it? But the other thing that really plays a role is how long is that tail? So polyunsaturated fats, and unsaturated fats, which are health promoting, they're really long tails. When you come to the tails that are what we call medium chain, so they're a little bit shorter, our body absorbs them differently. So we've been using MCT oil therapeutically for a really long time for people that have metabolically complicated diseases and are not getting in enough calories to thrive. By giving them MCT oil, it's absorbed directly into the body and doesn't kind of go through that normal digestive process. From that, we've gathered some evidence that shows that there might be some other advantages to MCT oil. So for example, it's very taxing to the body to try to process that. So maybe it's helping the body actually burn more calories. Well, from a I want to lose weight perspective, that's appealing. But the research has not panned out yet that for the general public, including MCT oils is beneficial in promoting weight loss, for example, or other things. That is still very, very young science, and I'd be cautious about that. The other thing about MCT oil is because you're not absorbing it normally, you're essentially malabsorbing it. It does cause GI distress, and it can really cause explosive diarrhea in people that start including it, especially if you include too much too fast. So be really cautious about that. But there is a higher level of those medium chain length tails in grass-fed butter and meat. But again, until we know, is there a true clinical benefit from including medium chain fatty acids in the diet? How much is that? Is including grass-fed butter and meat going to be contribute enough to my diet to be worthwhile? Until we kind of know all of those answers, it's really hard to justify telling somebody to spend the money on these foods because they tend to be really expensive, when maybe that money would be better spent on a nice plant-based oil, more fruits and vegetables, some whole grains instead of refined carbohydrates. From a sustainability and environmental perspective, there's definitely advantage there, but from a health perspective, there's not necessarily any harm, but it's not a license then to go out and consume as much buttery meat as you want to because it comes from a grass-fed animal. And then finally, I want to just come back to coconut oil. Again, it does have a health halo. It is delicious. It does have a high smoke point, so you can cook in a really high heat with it. But 87% of it is saturated fat. And a small portion of those saturated fats are these medium chain lengths that we've been talking about. Is there going to end up being an application for, Mr. and Mrs. Smith out there in the world that's trying to be as healthy as possible by including it? To be determined. What we do know is right now it's pretty much a saturated fat. You can tell that because it's solid at room temperature, and we get more saturated fat in our diet than we need. We certainly don't need to be adding it on purpose. So with that, I would love to open up the floor, if you will, to the audience. And I want to summarize that, research has just confirmed that it's the type of fat that we eat is more important than the amount of fat that we eat, although the amount of fat we eat is important if you're trying to manage your weight. Oils have a more favorable effect in the body, like on our cholesterol, than solid fats. But fats are delicious and they help to make our foods delicious. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to eat a salad with no dressing on it at all, but come on, you do that like once, right? So when you include your fats, we want to make the right choices. We want to enjoy them, and we just want to watch their portions. And I bet Danielle's got like an amazing recipe up one side and down the other that we can include to show us all how to do this.
I'm taking so many notes. And thank you. We do have a lot of questions though. Go ahead and with the first one. The first one is, please. Can you explain why some diets promote no oil, like the autoimmune protocol diet? Is that ever a good idea or not?
Okay, that's a great question. So the autoimmune protocol diet advocates for no oils. Well, let me just back up. They actually say if you follow this diet, which is very much just like a clean eating diet, right? No sugar and low sodium and whole unprocessed foods. And what they're basically saying is by following this diet, you're going to reduce your inflammation and some other symptoms. Sure, I think everybody's got room for cleaning up a little bit and they would probably see some benefit. They have a staged approach where there's like this elimination diet where you really come down to the bare bones. And in that phase, there's a no oil recommendation, and then certain ones get added back. Another diet that really is hardcore no oil is Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. So he does a lot of the cancer research and like the prevention and reverse heart disease program, and he's got amazing data. I know him, I've seen him present, and even he will say the issue is it's really hard to stick to. Like absolutely no oil ever in anything, in cooking, whatever. It's really hard to stick to. It tends to socially isolate you because it means that you can't eat with like at other people's houses or out to dinner, etc. And it does put you at risk for being deficient in some of the nutrients that you actually require fats in order for your body to absorb and make available. So I'm not a huge fan of the no oil diets. I tend to not be a huge fan of anything that's quite so drastic because there's always going to be a very high risk. If there's a reason why you're interested in that, I would encourage you again to meet with a registered dietitian and get some one-on-one assessment and advice.
That's great advice. Just a reminder for everyone, you can also and always email Debbie at rdn@outlook.com. So if you don't have enough time for all of the questions, feel free to reach out.
Debbie Petitpain, rdn@outlook.com.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question number 2 is my LDL is 102 right now. Is that high, and how can I reduce it?
That's a great question. And I would not say, 102 is terribly high if the cutoff is 1. There are some lab results that, the number after the decimal, if it moves even a little bit, is clinically significant. So I can see the question of, is this? It's not really. My guess would be then that perhaps your total cholesterol is a little bit high too. Those two things kind of tend to trend in the same direction. So just making some of the simple switches that we talked about. Do you have solid fats in your diet that you could replace with plant-based liquid oils instead? Could you reduce the portions of the amount of fats that you're doing in your diet? And one of the easiest way to do that is to not do fried foods. And then generally speaking, how is your omega-3 fatty acid intake? So are you a fish eater? And if so, could you include it 2 times a week, but not fried? So I live in the South, and when we talk about eating fish, of course it's fried. So I have to really make sure that I qualify. Don't fry it, but if you've got another way that you can consume it, and if you don't eat fish, could you look at some of those other sources? Supplementation with omega-3 can happen. We don't have quite the best dosing recommendations from the government on that, but particularly for high-risk groups, which I consider pregnant women and lactating women, because omega-3 is so important in brain development when babies are growing in the womb and then in that first 2 years of life, that might be a time for supplementation. So we've all seen fish oils out there, supplements out there. There's algae-based supplements too. So if you're vegan or vegetarian, you don't want to include that or have an allergy, that might be an option as well.
Cool. Just saying, I have a mean fish soup recipe on my blog, so just saying.
There you go. Try that. That sounds awesome.
Another question is, and I can relate to this question actually. It says, I have healthy cholesterol levels, IDL and HDL. I have a healthy weight, but my arthritis symptoms are still bad. Is there any other anti-inflammatory diet tips?
Sure. What is still bad though? HDL and LDL are fine, but
everything is fine. Healthy cholesterol, healthy IDL, healthy HDL, but the symptoms of arthritis are still.
Oh, okay. So it's not all cholesterol driven, right? So the idea is that inflammation can be caused by a lot of things, and unfortunately can be caused by a lot of things that are not even dietary related. So the best thing that we can do is try to include as many anti-inflammatory foods and food patterns in your diet as possible. And I would say that one of the best things is these really rich in color fruits and vegetables. We know, for example, things like dark green leafy vegetables, berries. Fish is another one. So the research is pretty clear that the omega-3 fatty acid content in your diet can help to reduce inflammation overall. If we measure it by the inflammatory marker called C-reactive protein, or CRP, we know that CRP will reduce if you get not just more omega-3 in your diet, but less omega-6. So maybe look at those sources of omega-6. It's the ratio between the two that really seems to be important. And not to get too deep in it, but if you can reduce your omega-6 intake as well, that could be another place to look at. Things like sugar have been shown to be inflammatory. They may not necessarily affect your cholesterol. For some people, it makes their triglycerides go up, but do you have too much sugar in your diet? And then of course, your overall well-being around stress, exercise, and sleep.
Okay.
I'm probably telling you all the things you already know, and I'm sorry I have no magic bullet, but maybe a couple tweaks are available for you there.
That's confirmation and validation. So that's a great answer, actually. Great advice. Number 4 is, does cheese and lactose cheese have trans fat?
So that's a great question. So, and this is where you guys always get to the like asterisk of it all, right? So the asterisk is that the trans fat that we're truly concerned about is the artificially made trans fat that we sort of produced and invented, if you will, in processing foods. There's always been trans fat naturally occurring in the foods produced by ruminant animals. So ruminant animals are those ones that have like multiple stomachs, which cows do. But the evidence so far shows that the trans fat that's naturally occurring from those animal foods is not really what we're concerned about. What I would say is the more concerning nutrient in something like cheese is going to be the saturated fat and the sodium. Now, I'm not really sure where you're going with the lactose question, but what I will say is lactose is found in the watery part of dairy. So when you strain that out to make something like yogurt, cottage cheese, or cheese, the lactose content comes way down.
Okay, cool. Thank you. This is the last question probably for tonight.
Okay.
And the question is, which oils are the best for arthritis? And what's the healthiest way to cook with them? Talking about olive oil, canola oil, grapeseed, or avocado oil. Okay,
so those are great questions. I would say that the best oils for arthritis are, first of all, they're oils and not solid fats. And they're going to be the ones that have a higher omega-3 content and a lower omega-6, and you can Google a lot of that, but it tends to be things like extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, and canola oil. And I'll tell you that canola oil gets a bad rap because, just as a side note of that, it was originally grown in Canada as rapeseed, and the original strain of it did end up having some problems, but the modern version that we use now and the modern way we process it does not. And it has a higher omega-3 content in it than olive oil does. And it also has a higher smoke point. And smoke point means you can cook with it at a higher temperature before it starts to break down. So I really like canola oil. It also has a really neutral flavor. I love olive oil too, but it affects, like it influences, ask Daniel, it influences the flavor of things, whereas canola oil doesn't as much. But really, I like it because 1.5 tablespoons a day will help you meet your needs for the omega-3 content that you actually need. Regarding smoke point, you can also sort of Google that. Some of these plant oils, the hotter you get them, the more they start to break down. And you'll know that you've reached that without a thermometer because you'll smell it. Everybody knows kind of that smell. But what I would say is that the research overall is saying we should be cooking at lower temperatures, that there are chemicals that start to get produced when we cook at high heat, whether it's on the barbecue, whether it's frying, whether it's sauteing on a pan on the stove. So if you can just sort of cook at a lower temperature, low and slow, doing the grilling, the baking, the sauteing, I'm sure Daniel's got a lot of recipes that help you cook at a lower temperature. The smoke point kind of becomes irrelevant, but if you're concerned, you can always Google like, hey, what's the smoke point of X, Y, and Z? But just to summarize what the answer is, I would stick with your extra virgin olive oil, your light olive oil if you need to cook at a slightly higher temperature. I love the canola oil for the omega-3 content. Avocado oil is a really good one too, and you can get it pretty hot.
I'm a fan of low and slow and poaching. So yeah.
Yes. One other thing too, just because omega-3s keep coming up, and I just reminded myself of this the other day, there's omega-3 rich eggs out there. So if you're an egg eater, it's kind of, and the way that the omega-3 content in the eggs gets higher is you feed your chickens omega-3 rich feed. I have chickens and they're really vocal if you don't feed them at 6:30 in the morning. And I'm like, oh my God. They don't get that there's been a time change. Like they're just all over the place. But then the omega-3 is concentrated in the yolk. So if you're gonna spend the money, because they're more expensive, to buy omega-3 rich eggs, don't throw the yolk out. Save that for when you need a whole egg for something. And that's another way you can get them in.
Oh, interesting. That's yeah. We do have more questions, Debbie.
Okay.
So the next question is, okay. This is a tricky one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It says, I read that frying with vegetable oils can be worse for the body than cooking with lard. Is that true?
I've heard that too. I think this goes back, honestly, I'm not sure what the root like complaint is. And if I knew that, it'd be easier to speak to it. So I'm going to make some assumptions here. I'm going to assume that the issue is a smoke point, coming back to kind of this idea that you can cook. Lard, you have a smoke point maybe around like 370, 375, but, and that's higher than butter. So that might be sort of like the platform from which we make these other assumptions. But there are a lot of oils that you can get hotter, including the ones that we mentioned. The other thing about lard that has classically made it really great for cooking is it has a very low water content. So butter actually surprisingly has a lot of water in it. Lard really has very, very little. So if you're making, let's say you're making a pie crust. If you make a pie crust with butter, it'll come out pretty good. If you make a pie crust with lard or like Crisco, it's going to be amazing because when you put it in the oven, there's no water to turn to steam and get it wet. And so I think that's also another place where lard gets a little bit from culinarians leg up. And then the last thing is that if we go all the way back to that conversation about grass-fed beef, grass-fed butter, we could loop grass-fed lard into that too. So this conversation around, well, some of the carbons in there are shorter length and that might be health promoting, but like we're really splitting hairs there. And I just kind of don't sign off to that.
Okay. Quick question about a very famous or popular device nowadays, air frying. What do you think about air frying?
Yeah, I'm buying one for my husband for Christmas, so don't tell him. That'll spoil the surprise. Air frying has really taken off because, of course, one of the things that oils and deep frying do for us is, again, because you're using a very low water medium, and even if you're putting a food in boiling oil to fry it, immediately the moisture evaporates. So you get this nice crunch, you get this nice color. It's very hard to replicate that when you start talking to people about not frying. Again, I live in the South, we love our fried chicken. And when I try to talk to people about we can't fry our chicken, they're like, awesome, but I still want all of that, right? So the air fryers, what they do is they actually circulate really high heat around the food with small droplets of oil in it. And both from like a food science literature perspective, but mostly I ask my friends, like, is it doing it for you? There's pretty good results. I'm not going to say it's perfect. I've not found anyone who says that. I think the size of the food matters and how wet the food is matters, but from like a health perspective, instead of using cups of oil to fry something in, which your food absorbs a lot of, not 100%, but a lot of it, in the air fryer, you're only using tablespoons. So it's helping you to reduce the amount, and you can use these like plant-based oils we've been talking about, whereas with deep frying, we tend to use some of those oils that are higher in the omega-6, like peanut oil and vegetable oils, not the best choices.
Good. And for those that don't have an air fryer at home, you can also use the convection mode of your oven, and that's going to be a similar effect of the air frying.
Awesome.
There's another question, probably from a parent.
Okay.
Tips on getting picky children or adults to eat more healthy fats and veggies.
I have 2 girls, and one of them is great and eats a variety of foods and is willing to try new things. And the other one, if it's not some version of mac and cheese or cheese quesadilla, she's not touching it. So I'm hopeful that they just all go through that phase and come out on the other side. So I feel you. I think so much of it has to do with the choices as far as the healthy fats that you are using in your culinary preparations, that by making some of the swaps we've been talking about, your children are not going to notice. They're not going to know like what oil you sauteed in or how you made your salad dressing, or, okay, you're not offering butter on the table anymore, for example. So I would start there. You could try some of the snacks like avocado and olives actually are nice sources of healthy fats. My kids actually really like olives a lot, I think, because they can stick them on the ends of their fingers and they think that's cool. And of course, with avocado, they can like smash it up to make guacamole and eat it in a variety of ways. So you could try something like that. With the vegetables, there's two schools of thought. One is, could you start to just slide it into other things? And I think from a nutrient perspective, there's value in that. So could you put extra in your soups and stews? Could you puree something that you slide into a baked good? Could you make more like mixed dishes where they can't pick out every single piece, although my older one will pick out every single piece? But at the end of the day, we still want them just to hear that consistent message that, look, these are health promoting foods and they don't have to be your favorite. No one's ever going to say they taste like chocolate cake, but you still need to include them regularly and just be persistent over time in the same way we talk to them about, you know, alcohol or smoking. Like, it's never the one message, it's the consistent message over time. And the most important thing is for you to model that behavior. So as long as you're not making a super big deal of it, but they see you eating a wide variety of the foods that you want them to eat, they will come around.
I'm with you. Behavior and habits are key here, right?
Yeah.
There's one last question.
Sure.
Last question. It says, what's better, butter, margarine, or fortified butter replacements, like something that's called smart balance?
Okay, that was hard because, so going back all the way to that trans fat conversation, we told everybody, don't eat butter, it's so bad for you, it's high in saturated fat, eat margarine. And then we came back and we're like, oh my God, we invented this thing that's even worse and it's in the margarine. Don't eat the margarine, eat the butter. And it's like the #1 skit of why people roll their eyes when dietitians come out with some piece of advice about something, right? And I feel ya. But part of it is that the foodscape that we all live in is changing constantly. So like the products we had 10 years ago are not the products we have now. And it's just like this moving kind of whack-a-mole landscape. So I think that I would look at a couple things. First of all, I would say that the liquid fats are still always going to be better than solid fat, kind of period. So is there a reason why you feel like you need something that's spreadable? Maybe there is. The second thing is that at least with butter, it's like a single nutrient food and you really know what you're getting. So how does this thing that you're comparing it to, how does it stack up? So first of all, does it have trans fat in it? Does the trans fat say it's 0? Okay, 0. Check the ingredients. Does it say there's anything hydrogenated? No. Okay. Butter is 100 calories per tablespoon. Does this save you any calories? That would be an advantage. And does it save you any saturated fat? So like, for example, if you're looking at a spread that says it's made with olive oil, that's great, but it doesn't mean there's not saturated fat in it. And that's really the nutrient we're trying to avoid. So it's really a matter of looking at that label and saying, well, how would this compare to sort of like the source thing that I'm trying to replace it with? Because at the end of the day, if you feel like you're having butter and it's decadent and you enjoy it and you know you shouldn't do it all the time, but it's really hitting your spot, that's fine, right? Like we all have room to include the things we really enjoy. And then the last thing that I would say is, does it have something added, and this is what I think you mean by fortified, to it that's going to actually give me something I don't get from my other foods? And really the best, so I know that they're adding like calcium and vitamin D. I don't think you can eat enough of that stuff for that to be relevant. I just wouldn't worry about that. But the one product that's out there is the ones that have stanols in it that purport to reduce your cholesterol. So plant stanols, which are found primarily in soy, if you consume enough of them, they will reduce your cholesterol. So coming back to the woman who has a question about her LDL at 102, you could also try to include more soy in your diet and see if that helps. And it is clinically proven to work, but you have to dose it because it's like a medication. Which means you have to eat a certain amount and you have to eat a certain amount all the time, which both drives up your grocery bill cost and it comes at a calorie cost. So where else in your diet are you going to trim the calories so that by adding this, you're not adding weight? Those would be the 3 things. So is it, can you just do a liquid oil? Is there a reason you need it to be spreadable? How does the nutrition compare to just using straight up butter? And is it providing a nutrient that you're not getting somewhere else in your diet that you feel like this is going to help you?
Fantastic. That's great. Debbie, that was the last question.
Okay.
And I encourage everyone to contact Debbie directly if you have questions and we didn't answer the question right here. Remember her email, which is Debbie?
Debbie Petitpain, RDN @outlook.com. And I'm sure the Arthritis Foundation will share that with you in some other media as well.
And you'll see it in the recording afterwards.
Yeah, and it's on the slide. So if you go back to the recording, it's on the slide. So thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Great questions. I always feel like I'm in the, Jeopardy, my own version of Jeopardy when I'm here with those. But thank you all so much for your time today.
David, thank you so much. I think I talk on behalf of everyone. We learned a lot today. Thank you so much for taking these extra minutes to, expand a little more on some topics and answer all of the questions. Again, we're really grateful to have you as part of the Arthritis Foundation group and for being here tonight. So thank you so much. And for everyone, just a few more announcements before you guys go. Let me just remind you about the insights. Remember, the Insights program is how we in the Arthritis Foundation, we understand data and we do something with that information. We create new programs. We find ways to help you in a better way. So please go ahead and look at the website, look for the Insights program and take a few minutes, take 10 minutes of your time and go ahead and take a look. Remember, we also launched the GA Insights program for juvenile arthritis people. Keep that in mind too. Just to let you know about some other webinars and events that are coming up to your programming. We do have the Live Yes RA virtual event that's going to happen on November 17th. We also have the VIM Challenge Kickoff event, which is the topic is going to be emotional wellness. Remember, the VIM is a new app that's going to help you track your wellness. It's amazing. I've been using it for a couple of months, and it's a great place for you to track your wellness, right? We do have a podcast. I think you're aware of that. You can find the podcast in the foundation website or arthritis.org/podcast. Go take a look, give it a listen. Great for a workout in the morning or a walk in the afternoon. You'll love it. We do have some other community events as well. You can find all about them in arthritis.org/live-yes as well. We do have a helpline. If you have any question that maybe it wasn't for Debbie or myself, you can always use the helpline that is on the screen right now. It's 1-800-283-7800, or go to a website, arthritis.org/helpline. We want to help you, and if we can help you, we will do it. Again, Insights, please help us out. Share that URL, that link with the loved ones, your friends, and your Facebook, Instagram, all over social media. It's gonna help the foundation a lot to provide a better service for all of us. So I think that is it for tonight. I wanna thank you so much. My name is Daniel. My blog is thisismytake.com. I appreciate your time and see you soon.